Welcome to everyone to our new episode, Human Brain Expo, dedicated to human brain health, wellness, and also everything related to it. Because nowadays we found more and more very interesting disciplines that actually highly connected to the brain health. Anyway, today we are talking to the very special guest, Dr. David Yeomans. Actually is a professor and director at the pain research at Stanford University. We are very flattered to see him, and we're very thankful to Dr. David that he found the time for us. Thank you so much for being with us.
I'm delighted to be with you.
Okay, I actually prepared a lot of questions because I believe that pain is something. Well, it's well known. It's well-known fact that pain is the most interesting subject matter, and pain relief is ability management is strongly connected to not just life vital things and enjoyment, but to the overall, to the life itself, meaning that how human is able to withstand pain completely defines how long this person lives and how well this person feels during the life. Right? Do you agree with it?
I do, but I don't want to forget the important function pain has in life, right? So it has a very strong protective function. Why do we have pain? Right? There is, if you think of it evolutionarily, there are reasons, right? And so when you get to certain chronic pain states, the question is much more pertinent than why is it there? What does it accomplish in terms of the body's function? But generally speaking, if you touch a hot stove and it doesn't hurt, you won't know to pull your hand away, right? And if you don't pull your hand away, you're going to damage your tissue, right? So again, it's protective, and there's different types of pain and different types of underlying anatomy, underlying physiology of different types of pain, and these different types of pain mean different things to the body and are responsive to different types of treatment.
For our body, it's actually trying to protect our body with the pain, simply trying to protect itself. So
Yep.
The thing is, nowadays we have very common drugs, painkillers. How the usage of common painkillers is actually influence the body ability to protect and heal. For example, I'm experiencing pain, okay? And in normal setting, what body would do? Body would, get a sleep, right? Or manage somehow, other ways. But what we do, normal humans do, we just take a pill and keep working. And eventually it can become a chronic pain. How bad the influence of the interruption to the normal body course with pain relief, like painkillers. Do we know something about it nowadays?
Interesting, very interesting thoughts on this. I mean, most people don't think of pain in that way as something we need to keep, as opposed to something we need. So if you go in for surgery and they cut you, right? Because that's what you do in surgery, right? So if you were awake, you would be screaming your head off, right?
Yes.
But you're asleep, and they cut you. Then what happens after that? So after you have surgery, when you wake up, what do? Right? They give you painkillers. But if you don't have painkillers, you don't recover well. And there's different aspects of that. So pain can actually have a strong physiologic effect that can impede your ability to heal. So it can drive inflammation, for example. And then so if you but again, I don't want to. One key thing about pain is it's not monolithic. That is to say, they're not all the same. So even in the post-operative situation, if a patient is given like morphine, for example, it does a really good job of holding down the pain as long as you don't move, and as long as they don't do something like change your dressing, your wound dressing, or make you cough, or all these things they do. And the morphine doesn't help much at all for there. Now, why is that? So it turns out that there are two main types of peripheral nerves that carry pain information. Some are unmyelinated, so they don't have myelin sheaths, right? And some are myelinated. And so, the ones that are myelinated conduct these nerve impulses, the action potential is much faster. So just as another aside, an example, if I took a pin and I poked your toe, you actually feel two pains. You feel a sharp pain, which is the needle going in, or the pin going into your toe, and that pain is carried by these myelinated pain fibers because it conducts fast at about 10 meters per second. Whereas maybe a second or so later, you feel a burning pain. And that is because that is information carried by these unmyelinated pain fibers, which conduct these nerve impulses at about 1 meter per second. So if you're very tall, or if you're a giraffe, it can take many seconds, right, if you're a giraffe, before you actually feel that. So it turns out that the pain, this sharp pain, the first pain, is really not very affected by morphine and similar drugs at all. Whereas the slower burning pain is very affected by morphine and similar drugs. And so if you're laying there post-operatively and you are given morphine, the morphine does a good job at handling that second pain carried by these unmyelinated pain fibers. But the interesting thing about the myelinated ones, they're called A delta, if you just the technical name. If you have a constant stimulus like a wound or a burn or something like that, they fire, but then they shut off very quickly. So they're much more important in carrying information about change as opposed to constant or steady state. So if you're changed, so if they're going to shut off, that means that, and that pain is much less sensitive to the morphine, like I said. So as long as you lay there still, you're fine with the morphine. I mean, morphine has its own problems, so we could talk about that, of course, but I'm just saying in terms of handling your pain, it does fine. But if you, sorry, my earphone was dropping out. If you have, if you cough, if you get up to walk, if they change your dressing, all of those things reactivate these myelinated ones, and that pain is just as bad as if you never had the morphine on board. So sometimes you have to put a patient back under general anesthesia, put them to sleep, in order to change their dressing. And so so my point of all this is it's not all the same, right? Pain there's different types of pain with different physiologies.
That's amazing. I mean, thank you so much for explaining. So people actually, doctors put them asleep for the reason, right? Because if they will move, morphine simply will not work. And that actually brings another question. And I actually have this question in my list. So you mentioned very interesting subject matter, that the pain, there is a certain speed in which nerve can transfer the stimuli or whatever it is, signal from limb to brain. And the stimuli is actually learned. We know that phenomena when people without limb still feel like they have limb, or people who have chronic pain after surgery, after the pain was actually removed, they feel this pain for years after the surgery.
Yep.
And so there is actually pain. Basically, it's something that our brain interprets, the feeling of the body, right?
Yes. Pain is a sensation. Yes.
So it's basically
the highest order of your brain.
Yes.
Feel it. Yeah.
Can we mention what are those actually factors that influence the way we experience and feel pain? So first one, you mentioned the body activity. Right? What else?
So two things. So number one, if you're talking about chronic pain, and that can happen after surgery, and phantom limb pain, which is the other thing we were talking about. So after you have an amputation, you can continue to feel like you have that limb is still there and it's still painful. And so what's happened is you've had a reorganization in the spinal cord where all this pain information from the peripheral nerve comes in, right? It comes in and it synapses, it transfers that information to cells in your spinal cord, which then sort of integrates all information and sends information up to the brain. But what can happen in the spinal cord is you can have reorganization, or plasticity we call it, which in response to that pain. And so this is one reason why treating the pain after surgery is so important, because if you don't, then people can end up with chronic pain after the surgery because of the surgical wound. And if I cut your skin, or if I'm, changing things within you, I'm going to cut some nerves. So, for example, this is very common, for example, with breast reconstruction, because you have a lot of nerves in that tissue, that skin. And so when you cut that, you're actually cutting nerves, not just skin. And so a fair number of patients, if their pain after their surgery is not well controlled, can end up with chronic pain from that surgery. And so the same thing is true. So why is that true? Well, it's not the peripheral nerves aren't doing anything. They're not sending any information in to the spinal cord. It's the spinal cord itself that's become reorganized and now becomes hypersensitive to any kind of stimulation. So, for example, so you think sort of an example would be a sunburn. So if you have a sunburn, what happens if you rub that skin or you take a hot shower? Well, it's painful, right? Because of the sunburn. So what's happened is that the nervous system has become hypersensitive. So in that case, it's just the nerves themselves, but in the post-operative situation, it's the spinal cord that has changed those cells to become more likely to fire a nerve impulse up to the brain. But
does it mean that people, for example, with certain chronic condition, diabetes or whatever, they experience pain a lot more simply because the reorganization and the transfer of the neural impulses, so their spinal cord and the brain is a lot more sensitive. Is it true? I mean, is it legible?
Not for diabetes. So you're talking about diabetic neuropathy. So that's nerve injury caused by sugar, basically. And in that case, the nerves, the endings of the nerves in the skin and joints, etc., have become damaged, and when that happens, they become hypersensitive, and so that's how. So people with diabetic neuropathy have both what's called allodynia, which is when you rub the skin or you touch the skin, it's painful when it wouldn't normally be painful. But they also have what's called spontaneous pain, so pain without any kind of stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
And in both cases, what's happening is those peripheral nerves have become hypersensitive. The same thing happens in herpes. So if you have, what's it called? Can't think of the word. But post-herpetic neuralgia is the sort of scientific name for it. And so that is, again, that's caused by these viruses.
Question. Then just how long usually takes to, for example, a patient after a surgery, how long it takes to reorganize? Of course, it will depend from the age, right? Lots of factors, but in average, it can take years, right? For example, if a patient lost a limb or something was wrong with internal organ, whatever it is, it's transplant or whatever, how long it takes for the brain and for the spinal cord to reorganize when the patient is actually finally healed from the pain, from the experienced pain. It takes years, right?
I mean, so for example, with most surgical injuries that cause chronic pain, usually that pain is resolved within a year. But there are certainly a lot of cases where it isn't. So amputation, as you mentioned, can lead to phantom limb pain, we call it, which is, as I said, pain that you feel even though the limb isn't there anymore. And that one is actually, for that particular type of pain, there's a combination of reorganization, but also the cut nerve endings. So, if I cut your finger off or cut part of your arm off, that has nerves in it, right? And so those nerves are injured, and what happens is you have a concentration of sodium channels on those nerve endings. So what does that mean? So if I were to give you Novocaine or bupivacaine or lidocaine, any of these canes, including cocaine, by the way, any of these canes, those block sodium channels. They're called local anesthetics, and they make you numb, right? And because they're blocking these sodium channels, and nerves need these sodium channels. They need sodium coming into the nerve cell in order to fire, in order to produce these nerve impulses. So these canes will block those channels, so you never feel anything. But if you have an amputation or other similar nerve injury, then what can happen both is reorganization, as we were talking about, but also you have a translocation of sodium channels to the endings, to the damage. And so these nerve endings are now hypersensitive because there's so many sodium channels there. There's several different diseases that have that kind of thing too, but that's and so if you gave a patient with phantom limb pain and you injected lidocaine or one of the canes around that nerve ending, that would help. It wouldn't take care of it completely because they also have, they would also have some reorganization that's happened in their brain and their spinal cord.
Interesting. Talking about brain.
Yeah.
As I know, the approaches to the anesthesia changed in the last years a lot. And as I understood, it can people their body reacts different on the anesthesia depends on the depending on the age. So as I understood, like different type of generation requires different approaches to the anesthesia, and moreover, they getting out from the anesthesia in different ways, and it very depends on the generation. And as I understood, it's very specific, especially to the youngers. Can you please, because I've heard about it, and I read several articles about it, that younger generation, especially the one who was born after in 90s or earlier, they require special approaches because the way they've been treated before, because of the usage, certain cannabis and etc. It actually changes the way how their brain reacts to the anesthesia. Can you please cover a little bit, because it's very fascinating subject matter?
Sure. Yeah, it's not an area of expertise for me, but I can tell you that one of the things. So general anesthetics, so the gas anesthesia or the IV anesthesia, they act in part through this one protein called GABA, GABA receptors. And what so if you basically they turn on this GABA system, and the GABA system is important. It's an inhibitory system, so it can actually help you sleep, for example. And so in one of the things that cannabis can do is it can interact with this GABA system, and so it can make your system, for example, depending on how things are done, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but how much cannabis you've consumed, it can actually cause, again, a plasticity in the brain, which will affect how this GABA system responds to local anesthetics, or to general anesthetics, sorry. So, does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
All right. You also have things like people with red hair are about twice as sensitive to general anesthetics half as sensitive to general anesthetics as people with like dark hair. And so, so there are clear distinctions. Some of them are just genetic, but some of them are, in other words, born with genetic, like red hair, but some of them are changes in gene expression. So how much of a protein genes make that are induced by, for example, a lot of cannabis use. Does that make sense?
Wow, it's very it's interesting.
Sure. Well, good.
So basically, if a person simply uses, for whatever reason it is, cannabis, it will change the way person experience pain, and it will change the requirements for the painkiller and for the anesthesia in general. And what does it mean? Will it require more? It will require more.
So actually the opposite. And so the cannabis itself has some analgesic properties. So it can, inhibit pain. But the thing is that so cannabis acts at what are called cannabinoid receptors. So these are proteins that cannabis binds to, or the cannabis molecules bind to, and then cause different things. But there are more cannabis or cannabinoid receptors in the brain, in the nervous system, than any other receptor. So they have broad effects. So we're focusing on pain, but in fact, there's cannabis receptors in all over the brain, and so you have the potential to affect a lot of different things, and cognitive ability, mood, etc. And if you do enough of it, like anything else, you can cause plastic changes in the nervous system, including changes in the GABA system, which then change how susceptible someone is to general anesthesia. Does that make sense? I keep saying
Yes.
that makes sense.
Yes. And I would like to move to the area of the pain treatment.
Sure.
I know that the last year's been very productive science-wise, and we nowadays we have multiple approaches to the brain or to the pain treatments.
Yep.
And moreover, because lots of people nowadays, they have only one idea of the painkiller. There is only one well-known, broadly available for the general public. But those general painkillers, right, which works with prostaglandin, right? The classical.
You're thinking of things like aspirin or
Yes.
ibuprofen, that kind
Yes.
of thing, right?
So those
Yes, but
things have
prostaglandin is one
side
of the
effects.
targets. Anyway, go ahead.
Those things, they have side effects,
Yes.
big side effects, including on the pain management, right? So I cannot take for more than particular days ibuprofen, and I cannot take more than particular amount of ibuprofen, because otherwise it will work opposite way, right?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, the bigger problem with taking a lot of ibuprofen is all the tendency to cause bleeding in the gastrointestinal system, and so there are something like 100,000 hospitalizations in the U.S. from ibuprofen and similar drugs because of the impact they have on the stomach and the intestines. So, yeah, they're risky drugs. And then acetaminophen, Tylenol, which acts completely differently from ibuprofen. So it doesn't act at all the same. However, there are risks there for the liver. So if you take too much Tylenol, you very much can have a risk to do damage to your liver. So